And so he studies Congress specifically. So he's going to talk to you today about Congress governing. I looked at his presentation and I was really excited by it. A lot of interesting stuff in there, and I think you guys will really enjoy it. So let's hear it from Peter.
Hello, can everybody hear me? All right, so today we're going to be talking about Congress governing. So on Monday, we talked about representation. Today, we're going to talk about governing. Now, Congress has a lot of responsibilities when it comes to governing. In some ways, it's the most powerful branch. It's the only branch that can pass legislation without any of the other branches.
Oh, that was mine. That's what it's for.
So, kind of its responsibilities in terms of governing, it makes laws, it oversees the executive, making sure that the executive is operating efficiently and investigating them when need be. It controls taxes and funding and funds the services that the federal government provides. This is one of its main powers. It's called power of the purse. It basically controls the money supply. It appoints, or it confirms rather, judges to federal courts. It's the power to declare war, and it basically has the power to continue and enact any law necessary to carry out the powers given to it in the Constitution. So there's several important differences between the two houses of Congress, the chambers. So in the House, they're responsible for initiating revenue bills. Revenue bills involving taxation have to start in the House. Kind of the theory is that it's more responsive to the people. Senate is more involved in foreign policy. When you need to approve a treaty, all you need is the support of the Senate. Also, the House is far larger, 435 members versus 100. And kind of because of that, they are more specialized. So you can think of them, because there's so much more members in the House, they can focus on specific issues in more detail than the 100 senators in the Senate. Also, they represent the population more accurately in the sense that the House is appropriately determined by population. So each state, as you probably know, gets the amount of representatives based on its population. Well, the Senate really fundamentally represents states. And another big difference is, so the House has only 2-year terms for its representatives, much higher turnover in terms of the amount of elected. There's far more elections in the House than the Senate. The Senate has 6-year terms. So political regime. Now, the political regime is essentially an era in American history or in the present day in which a certain ideology dominates the legislative and executive branches, and often the judicial branches as well. Now, regimes kind of rise and fall based on economic conditions. Usually a regime kind of declines and falls during an economic crisis and is replaced by another regime. Now, an example of a regime is the New Deal regime. That's from 1933 to 1979, roughly. It kind of proceeds on those dates. But during this time, Congress invested in science. It invests in infrastructure. It raises the minimum wage. It encourages the building of low-cost housing. It regulates businesses, improves civil rights, and expands welfare programs. So you can kind of think of the New Deal era as the heyday of political liberalism in some ways in the United States. This is the time where Social Security is passed. This is the time where Medicare and Medicaid recent regime is, many people call it the neoliberal regime. This arose in the late 70s and early 80s. And, you know, the New Deal regime kind of came into power because of the Great Depression, because of the economic crisis that caused. Now, in the late 70s, early 80s, we had a different kind of economic crisis known as stagflation. Now, this is when there was high inflation and low GDP growth and high unemployment as well. So we've had high inflation fairly recently, but it's very different than the late 70s because we have had very, very strong job growth in this time period. Since Biden came into office, about 10 million jobs have been created. To put that in retrospect, during Obama's entire term, roughly 11 million jobs were created. The 10 million jobs in 2 years, very rapid expansion of the workforce. And we also had fairly strong GDP growth, especially in 2021. It slowed down somewhat in 2022. But generally, it's not nearly as bad as the kind of stagflation of the late 70s, early 80s. So the neoliberal regime was pioneered by Carter and Reagan. It involved deregulating businesses, cutting taxes, cutting welfare programs. This is a far more conservative regime for the New Deal era. And then we have very recently, perhaps, a new political regime. Now, this is fairly controversial, and there's a lot of disagreement and speculation when it comes to this. But it could be that the neoliberal era ended around 2020, and we're in a new unnamed regime. This regime was begun by Trump and Biden. It's characterized by Congress and the president investing in science, infrastructure, having massive economic stimulus during a downturn. So during 2020 and 2021, the U.S. government was spending money on a scale that hadn't seen since World War II. It's really a massive injection of federal dollars that's unprecedented in American history in a peacetime. It also is characterized by subsidizing clean energy, reducing student debt, industrial policy, which is essentially what it is it's when the government gets involved in promoting industries, usually manufacturing industries, to outcompete industries in other countries. So you can think of this as kind of attempting to create more manufacturing jobs in the United States. That's basically what characterizes this new regime. Now, regimes are very controversial in political science. Not every political scientist agrees that they exist. And like I said, the idea of a new regime right now is also very controversial. Part of the reason is in order to confirm that we have a regime, it has to last for a certain period of time, and there just hasn't been enough time to kind of confirm it at this point. Yes.
If I can interject there for just a second, we didn't get questions up, but this question over regime seems like a great question for focusing for the exam.
So, yeah, it's very controversial. Not every political scientist agrees with the idea of regimes or would characterize the regimes in this way that I have. But I think it's a very useful way of understanding American history and understanding our president and understanding how Congress governs in certain times and what to expect, essentially. So here's a question. Was Congress passing more left-wing legislation under President Nixon, which is a Republican, or under President Bill Clinton, which is Democrat?
You want to put that as a poll?
Sure. Do you want me to continue or?
Yeah, continue and I'll ask.
Okay. So, like I said, regimes can basically be used to predict and understand what Congress is going to say you wanted to pass more left-leaning legislation in the 1980s in the neoliberal regime, that's very unlikely. It's a conservative regime. So you can kind of expect a conservative regime, you're going to have conservative legislation. And a more liberal regime, you're going to have more liberal legislation. And if we are indeed in a new regime, we can expect that we're going to have more liberal policies going forward over the next 30 years or so. Regimes kind of vary in terms of the amount of time that they last, but it's fairly common that they last about 30 or 40 years. Status quo bias. So it's very difficult to pass anything through Congress. And we're going to kind of understand that more deeply when we go through how a bill becomes a law and that process. But basically, what status quo bias is in legislative policy, and we're going to go to like bureaucratic policy as well. It's far more likely that things will stay the same than change drastically. So don't expect that Congress is going to pass routinely big legislative initiatives that transform our society. It just doesn't happen that often. Now, there are exceptions that have occurred. There's periods in American history where a lot of legislation is passed very quickly. That's very significant. So in 1865 to 1870, this is kind of the era of when Reconstruction began. It's the era that ended slavery, 13, 14, and 15 amendments. Gave African American citizenship and gave them the right to vote, at least theoretically. So in 1913, 1914, this is when a lot of our largest financial regulated institutions were created. So the Federal Reserve created during this time period, hugely critical to the stability of the economy. The Federal Trade Commission, which is very important if you ever want to invest in stocks, because it basically forces companies to give a fair assessment and of their performance, so you can be confident in what you're investing in. In 1921, 1924, this is kind of a lot of tax cuts were being pushed at this time, higher tariffs, large immigration bills that greatly restricted immigration in the United States. 1933 to 1935, this is the New Deal era that we kind of talked about. 1964, 1965, this is the Great Society era. This is the Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. In this era, we finally, at the federal level, got rid of segregation, made that illegal. This is the era of Medicare and Medicaid. And 1979 to 1981. 1979 to 1981. This is kind of the neoliberal era. And it's pretty much characterized by massive deregulation, believe it or not, and tax cuts. So believe it or not, we used to regulate the trucking industry. The federal government would tell the trucking industry what routes it would have, where trucks could go. Same for the airline industry. That was all deregulated during this time. Had massive tax cuts. This is kind of the era of Reagan, like we talked about. So, looks like which president signed more left-leaning policy into effect, Clinton or Nixon? So most students at 54% said Clinton, and 46% said Nixon. Now, actually, the correct answer is the opposite. Richard Nixon, the Republican, essentially, in many ways, passed more left-leaning legislation. If you listen to his speeches, he talks about regulating the environment. He brags about we have more clean air and clean water than we've ever had before. He created the EPA, which is kind of the cornerstone of environmental protection in the United States. He also tries a lot of things that are very much against right-wing economic policies, like price control, trying to say try to regulate the price of oil. Essentially declaring what the price of oil should be from the government. Bill Clinton, on the other hand, shrank the government more than probably any president since World War II. Passed a massive bill to get tough on crime, led to mass incarceration. He opened up new trade deals, expanded trade with Mexico and Canada. So what you have to think in terms of these regimes, and kind of the point of this question, is that in the regime, like in a New Deal regime, both parties will be more left-wing. In the kind of neoliberal regime, Reagan era, both parties will be more right-wing. So another example is Eisenhower, a Republican president in the 1950s, was far more liberal than essentially any of our modern presidents. He expanded Social Security, raised the minimum wage, and invested billions and billions on infrastructure all over the country. So yeah, it's, you can, now one can say that in a regime, yes, like the party that's traditionally far right will be more right than the other one, but both parties are kind of moving to that right. So we can easily have a Democrat in a neoliberal regime that's far more conservative than a Republican in a New Deal regime. Does that make sense? So how a bill becomes a law? So there's essentially two ways. And they're fairly similar. They really only differentiate in one respect. We'll get into in a second. So first, the bill is proposed by a representative or senator and usually co-sponsored, which basically means other representatives, other senators support the bill, one kind of name, or add their name to the bill in support. Then it's sent to the committee, the relevant committee that is involved with, and then it's voted on by either the House or the Senate. And then essentially, if the House passes a bill, for example, and the Senate says, we like this bill, we don't want any changes, we'll just pass it as it is, then it goes straight to the White House and passes the veto and it becomes law. So the second way is repeating steps 1 through 3. So the proposed co-sponsored, goes to committee, voted on by the House or the Senate. Then if the other body, so say the Senate, votes and approves the bill. The House approves a bill that's similar but has important differences, and it will not just accept the Senate bill as it is. Then the bodies kind of come together and create what's called a conference committee. And that has members of both the House and the Senate. And they theoretically work out the differences, make a bill that's identical, and create what they call a conference report that's sent back to the houses or chambers. And if it's approved, then it's sent to the president. So basically the only difference is, does Congress just, if the House passes a bill, does the Senate just immediately adopt that bill to the letter, or do they have to come together to figure out the differences between the bills that they pass? So if this sounds like a complicated process, it is a complicated process. So in many countries in the developed world, it's far easier to enact legislation into law than in the United States. For example, in Canada, they have the Senate. The Senate technically has the power to block legislation like our Senate does, but it very rarely does that. It's appointed by the Prime Minister. And, the Senate has basically terms up to 75 years old. They have to retire at 75, but they're appointed by the Prime Minister. So it's considered to be not very legitimate, not representing people, very rarely exercising its powers. The Prime Minister, which is their equivalent of the President, is elected by the legislature, which essentially means that the party controlling the legislature will control the Prime Ministership, which kind of negates the power of the veto, because most likely the executive and legislative branches will be controlled by the same party, who want the same things. So basically the bottom line is, in the Canadian House of Commons, which is their version of the House of Representatives, if it passes, it's going to become law, or it's very likely going to become law. Where in our system, you have to go through all kinds of hurdles, like first pass the House, then the Senate, then in the Senate, the filibuster, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and then it has to pass the presidency as well. So it's far more challenging, it's far more difficult to pass any legislation in the United States than many other countries. Committees. Committees are very interesting. These are just a group of representatives or senators that focus on a specific policy area. Now, they're not in the Constitution, and many of them are based in Senate and House rules. So there's various different types of committees. Some of them are considered to be permanent, but none are. So essentially, there's committees that have lasted for a very long time. They're in the rules. In other words, the House of Representatives has rules that says we're going to have this committee. So that committee kind of goes from legislature, from the 18th Congress to the 19th Congress, and so on and so forth. Then there's committees that don't last as long as kind of created for a limited amount of time. But the important thing to remember is no committee is permanent. The House could change the rules to get rid of the longest lasting committees if it wanted to. The House or Senate could have no committees at all if it wanted to. And committees can be investigating any topic. So if the House wanted to create a committee investigating rubber ducks, you could do that. There's nothing stopping that from happening.
I mean, we do always tip over
You've always skipped over.
rubber ducks. It's a problem.
Yeah, it's true. Maybe we need to look into that.
And some don't squeak.
So, like I said, so the committees that are long lasting go from Congress to Congress. These are called standing committees. Select committees are the ones that are very high. There's many of them in American history. There was a select committee to investigate Richard Nixon. There was a select committee to investigate, I believe still is investigating January 6th. And then there's joint committees, which is a committee that has both House and Senate members on it. But these are more in terms of studying and research, studying and researching policies and initiatives. They're not really proposing or voting on bills and passing those through that committee. So the filibuster. So the filibuster is part of the Senate rules. It's not in the Constitution. And basically what it means is for most legislation, in order to end debate, you need 60 votes in the Senate. In other words, usually how legislation works is approved by the committee, and then the body, so the Senate in this case, will debate it and express their views to other senators, the public, and then they end the debate and vote on it. Well, the filibuster essentially allows them to never end the debate, so they can never vote on the legislation. And actually, right now, you don't even need to debate forever. You can basically just signal that that's what you intend to do, and that also shuts down the process. So because of this, senators that represent only 17% of the US population can block most legislation. So it's a very powerful force, obviously, in American politics. And like I said, it was created, or it's not in the Constitution. It was created by the state, by Aaron Burr. He really pushed for this in 1806. Does anybody know what Aaron Burr is famous for? Yes. That's right. So he's considered to be kind of a shady character in American history, to say the least. And
Well, no, that you knew that.
he basically, there was a rule in the Senate in 1806 to end the debate, but he thought that that was unnecessary. And it basically was just replicating on the rules that he convinced them to get rid of it. Later in the 1830s, senators realized that this loophole existed and started to exploit it. And the House actually used to have a filibuster, but it started to dismantle it in 1890, and around the 19 teens, it was pretty much done with. So there is precedent for getting rid of this sort of thing. So what has the filibuster blocked? Well, historically, the filibuster has been used to stop civil rights. So there was an anti-lynching bill that would have passed Congress in 1822 or 1920, excuse me, and would have passed if it wasn't for the filibuster. And this is just the first instance. There was several bills actually after this that would have made lynching illegal, but it wasn't passed because Southern senators didn't want that, and filibuster did. So another bill that was blocked was the poll tax, or getting rid of the poll tax in 1942. So this poll tax, as you probably know, was used by Southern states to really block African Americans from voting, going to polls. We could have gotten rid of that in 1942. We also could have ended workplace discrimination, or at least had laws in the books that ended in 1946. Now, these laws eventually did pass, but it took until the 1960s. So there were about 20 years extra in order to pass. And it was used to stop an amendment that would have got rid of the electoral college. So in 1970. So if that amendment had passed, you would have been able to, or the popular vote would have turned the president. The electoral college no longer exists. So you can say that filibuster is the direct cause of the Trump presidency. So maybe that improves the filibuster in your eyes, maybe it degrades it. I'm not sure. So, one more thing. Does anybody know who did the longest filibuster in American history? So in other words, stood up and spoke before Congress, trying to filibuster something. No. Oh, yes. Yeah, it was a really long time.
You read Dr. Seuss, didn't you?
No, that was Ted Cruz.
That's not long enough.
This is the 1950s.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's by Senator Strom Thurmond. And he was trying to block, I believe it was the 1957 Civil Rights Bill. He failed in that, but he spoke for so long that he needed to go to the bathroom. And his aides actually brought him a bucket where he kind of had one foot on the House floor, one foot in the courtroom, and took care of his business, and then kept talking the whole time in order to continue the filibuster. So yeah, that's the longest record in American history. Not exactly for a noble cause, I would say. So changes to the filibuster. Now, filibuster has been weakened significantly in recent years. So in 2013, the House is controlled by Democrats. They get rid of the filibuster for federal judges, all federal judges except for Supreme Court judges. And this way they can have Obama appoint more judges to different federal circuit courts. Then it's weakened by the Republicans in 2017 so they can have Supreme Court judges get passed by the Senate without filibuster of 60 votes. So Brett Kavanaugh, he's on the Supreme Court because of this change. How do we change the filibuster? So essentially, like you said, the filibuster is not in the Constitution. All that needs to be done is for the majority leaders basically propose a change to the Senate rules and have the majority of the senators support that. This is often called the nuclear option. Now, technically, it's very easy to get rid of the filibuster. All you need is the majority of senators. If every Democrat right now in the Senate agrees to get rid of the filibuster, they can do it right now. So it's really a matter of convincing senators to get rid of it. And there's a lot of opposition from Democratic senators right now including Joe Manchin, which is kind of seen in the background there. And kind of the argument is, well, if we get rid of the filibuster, then the opposing party will be able to also take advantage of that and ask for whatever they want as well, if they have a majority against it. So there's legitimate arguments on either side, but it does make passing most bills far more difficult and far easier to fly. So there's one big exception to the filibuster, and it's called budget reconciliation. Now, this was created in 1974, and essentially what it says is that certain kinds of bills can just be passed in the Senate by a majority vote. You don't need 60 votes to end the filibuster. And these bills have to be involved with taxation, spending, and federal deficit. So there's someone in the Senate called the Senate parliamentarian, and she essentially researches and enforces Senate rules. So in order to have your bill meet the standard for budget reconciliation, you need her to approve it, basically look it over and see if it is involved with the budget, the degree necessary to get through this process. Now, a lot of important pieces of legislation were passed through this process. So for example, Bush's tax cuts in both 2001 and 2003. Massive amendments to the Affordable Care Act in 2010 were passed through budget reconciliation. Trump's tax cuts, 2017, passed through budget reconciliation as well. And Biden's American Rescue Plan Inflation Reduction Act was passed through budget reconciliation as well. So we have a poll question here. And what should Congress be? Should it be more into problem solving or pragmatic? Should it be partisan and uncompromising? Hierarchical, leadership driven, or reorganized? Should be able to get that and get. All right. Are there any questions about Congress, about how Congress passing bills, about what we're doing? And then I can answer. Yes.
I got a question. Why is it capped at 435 in the House?
Wasn't it, I think it was the 1920s, which they basically, because they used to add new members every census to the House of Representatives, but they decided it was getting too big and too unwieldy. So they just capped it, I think it was 1924. I'm not sure on that exactly, but yeah, it was just kind of an arbitrary, like, this is as big as it is now, we don't want it to become any bigger. So it's 435. Any other questions? No? All right.
Yep, 38 seconds left to answer this poll.
So we have a little video here and a taste of it.
Which houses the Congress of the United States. Behind me is the Capitol building, which houses the Congress of the United States. Is it blank?
Oh.
Building, which houses the Congress of the United States. It's a blank Campbell legislature, meaning it has two chambers. The wing to my right houses the Senate, and the wing to my left is where the House of Representatives is. The blank Campbell legislature was the result of compromises made during the writing of the Constitution. Small states would not agree to a Congress with a large state because they were more populous states have equal representation. And the resulting compromise was the Senate, where each state has 2 senators, and the House of Representatives, where the House is apportioned according to population, the largest state having more members of the House. Now, some delegates feared that this arrangement would pit the large states against the small states on legislative issues. But as has happened over the course of American history, that lineup is
Here we have the result of our poll. Looks like 78% of you said you want Congress to be pragmatic and problem solving, 5% said partisan and compromising. 4% said different, and 15% said reorganized completely. So very interesting.
Instead, the typical division in the Congress of the United States is around political parties. Political parties were not in existence when the Constitution was written, but shortly thereafter, they became part of the American political system. And since then, divisions within the Congress, splits within Congress, have occurred largely around the party division. Seldom has that been more obvious than in recent years. The parties are quite far apart on the issues, deeply deadlocked within Congress, and oftentimes Congress has been gridlocked to such an extent that even pressing national issues have been passed on by the Congress. In the previous session on Congress, we examined the role of constituency. Here, we'll examine the role of political parties. We'll concentrate on the part they play in congressional leadership and in lawmaking. Now, we noted in the previous session that Congress is a fragmented institution. It has 2 co-equal chambers, and its members have a power base in their state or district, which makes them free agents to a considerable degree. So what holds Congress together? What serves as the glue that binds its members? The answer is partisanship. Members of the same party typically have more in common with each other than with members of the other party, which enables them to pursue shared goals. Partisanship is also the basis on which congressional leaders are picked. In both the House and the Senate, the top leaders are party leaders. In the House, the highest ranking leader is the Speaker. Although theoretically chosen by a vote of the full House, the Speaker has always been a member of the chamber's majority party. Its members have enough votes to pick one of their own as Speaker, and that's what they've always done. Assisting the Speaker is the House Majority Leader, who helps develop the majority party's legislative agenda, and the House Majority Whip, who has the job of making sure that the party's members are in attendance when key votes are taken. Now, the Speaker's role is particularly noteworthy. The Speaker is sometimes called the second most powerful official in Washington. The Speaker's power derives mainly from the fact that the House is a very large body. It has 435 members, so many members that chaos would result if the House was not governed by strict rules. The Speaker decides, for example, which members will be allowed to speak on a bill and for how long. In effect, the Speaker also decides which bills will be taken up by the House, in what order they will be voted upon, and whether amendments to a bill will be allowed. Now, this might sound as if the Speaker has dictatorial power, but what must always be kept in mind about Congress is that its members cannot be forced to support their party on legislative issues. They hold their election to the constituents of their district or state, rather than the party leaders. As a result, the Speaker and other congressional leaders must be mindful of what their party members will willingly support. Rather than dictating, congressional leaders are negotiating. They work to develop legislative positions that are consistent with the party's goals, but that are also acceptable to most of their party's members. On the Senate side, the top party leader is the Senate Majority Leader. Assisting the Majority Leader is the Senate Majority Whip, who, like the House Whip, is charged with lining up party votes on key issues. The Senate Majority Leader is chosen by the chamber's majority and works with it to develop the party's legislative agenda and manage the flow of bills through the Senate. However, unlike the Speaker, the Majority Leader does not control Senate debate. Under Senate rules, each member can speak on any bill and at any length. Sometimes the minority of the members will exercise that right by talking endlessly in order to stop a bill from coming up for a vote. That's called a filibuster. It's a tactic that's been employed many times in Senate history. Now, a filibuster can be stopped if 3/5 of the members vote to limit debate. That procedure is called cloture. Notice that cloture requires a 3/5 majority rather than a simple majority. Unless 60 of the 100 senators agree to end, the filibuster cannot be stopped. That's an imposing requirement. The minority party also has its House and Senate leaders. There's a minority leader and a minority whip in each chamber. Their roles are comparable to those of the majority leader and whip, but they're in a less powerful position because their party has fewer members. Political parties are also the basis on which Congress's standing committees are organized. As was discussed in the previous session, most of the work in Congress is done through standing committees, such as the House and Senate Agriculture Committees. Currently, the House has 20 subcommittees, while the Senate has 16. Each standing committee is headed by a chair who is chosen by the majority party and is a member of that party. The majority party also has more seats on each committee than does the minority party. Now, this arrangement allows the majority party members to control committee action. If they're united, they have the votes to determine a bill's provisions and whether the bill will be submitted to the full chamber for a vote. In these various respects, Congress resembles other national legislatures, which are also organized along party lines. What makes Congress unusual is that its members are not bound to their party. Unlike party members in most other legislatures, they cannot be forced to support the party on key issues. Their base of power, as I noted earlier, is not the national party, but the constituents in their state or district. They can get away with angering their party leaders as long as they retain their constituent support. Now, because members are relatively free agents, the role that the parties play in Congress depends on whether a party's House and Senate members share the same policy goals. If they think alike, they'll work together and in opposition to the other party. On the other hand, if they differ widely in their policy goals, party leaders will have difficulty getting them to work together. That was the case for much of the 20th century. Rather than being united, the congressional parties were factionalized. The Democratic Party had a liberal wing, consisting largely of its northern members, and a conservative wing, made up largely of its southern members. For its part, the Republican Party had a progressive wing, consisting largely of its members from the Northeast and Upper Midwest, and a conservative wing, consisting largely of its members from other parts of the country.
All right, we're taking attendance, just as a reminder.
These ideological differences were large enough that lawmakers from the same party often voted in opposing ways. Let me give you an example. It's the vote on the landmark 1965 Medicaid bill, which provided government-paid health care for lower-income families. The bill was introduced in Congress by liberal Democrats with the backing of Democratic President Lyndon Johnson. At the time, the Democratic Party had a huge majority in Congress, so the Medicaid bill passed with votes to spare. But consider the votes of the different party factions. In the Senate, for example, only 61% of Democrats from the South, the party's conservative stronghold, voted for the bill, compared with 98% of Democrats from outside the South. On the Republican side, 82% of senators from the Northeastern and Upper Midwest states, the party's progressive stronghold, voted for the bill, compared to only 19% of Senate Republicans from other states. Such divisions in Congress were relatively common 50 years ago. Congress was not an institution where one party's members regularly lined up against those of the other party. That's no longer the case, and it's due to changes set in motion when Northern Democrats took the lead in pushing the 1964 Civil Rights Act through Congress. Their chief opponents were not Republicans, but instead their fellow Democrats, those from the South. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was one of the most bitterly contested bills in the history of Congress. Southern Democrats used every legislative tactic imaginable, from blocking action in committee to a Senate filibuster in their effort to defeat the bill. It took nearly a year for the 1964 Civil Rights Act to make its way successfully through Congress. Its passage changed the nation's politics, a fact that President Johnson recognized immediately. In signing the Civil Rights Act into law, Johnson turned to an aide and said, "I've just signed away the South for a generation." The South, which had voted solidly Democratic in every election since the Civil War reconstruction, began to move away from the Democratic Party. Here's a chart that shows the extent of the shift. In the mid-60s, at the time of the Civil Rights Act, Democrats held an overwhelming share of the South's House and Senate seats. Today, it is Republicans who have a huge edge in the South. The party's position in the South has been totally reversed. The effect of this change was trivial.
You can see from the video, we're dealing in the 1960s, the New Deal era regime. And so you have Republican senators supporting massive infusions, or massive expansion of federal programs, Medicare and Medicaid, expansions in civil rights. You see a divide in the South, between more conservative, or in the Democratic Party in the South, more conservative Democrats and more liberal Democrats in the North. And then you see another kind of underlying theory of regime change, which is constituent change. So regimes can change when a region like the South, because of cultural issues,